Welcome to Your Wealth Matters. I'm Janet Kim Singh, and I'm joined by my fellow portfolio manager on the private wealth team, Maria Dawes. And today we're talking about how to formulate return objectives as well as how to evaluate your return. Maria, let's dive right in since this is sort of a two-parter. So firstly, how does one come up with a return requirement?
Thanks, Janet. So, for the basis of this discussion, let's assume we're talking about private clients because institutions and the likes can be a bit of a different beast. So, sometimes clients will already, in fact, come to us with return objective in mind. Sometimes it's inflation plus 2%, for example, or sometimes it's just a number that seems reasonable to them. Where I usually like to start the conversation with clients is what is the goal of the portfolio and then work backwards from there. If the goal of the portfolio is to be able to provide for cash flow in retirement, for example, then we need to look at what type of income the client might need during this phase of life. And this in itself can be a full meeting, but this is also part of the financial planning process. And from there, we can make certain assumptions, such as retirement age, the age upon passing, and other such considerations, like do you want to leave a lump sum behind as an inheritance, and all kinds of other details. These can be varied. There are obviously limitations in the retirement planning process, but this at least gives us a good start. At a very basic level, if one is trying to grow their portfolio from, let's say, 800,000 to a million in the next 5 years to provide a modest amount of income without having to touch too much principal, then we'd be looking at a return objective of about 25% or 5% annually. That's just one scenario, of course, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how to formulate a return objective. And really, this is just a really basic overview. But Janet, we do need to move on. So let's talk about how to evaluate your return because that's a biggie.
Sure. So to give a meaningful definition, we must first back up and consider what we call absolute return. And Ria, that's what you were talking about just now. Absolute return is how much money you made or need to make. As an example, this year my portfolio made 4%. This is what we tend to naturally focus on. We also have relative returns, which is when you're comparing how well your portfolio did relative to something, usually a benchmark. Why are benchmarks relevant? Pensions and institutions will typically have a benchmark as their base for their return requirements. After all, if an active manager isn't at least beating a benchmark, then they might be better off in a passive ETF. That's the argument anyways, and we won't digress too much into passive versus active management, so I'll leave it there. However, using a benchmark such as the S&P 500 or the S&P and TSX Composite can be a useful guide and provide some additional context when evaluating your return. For example, if a client's annual return is 2%, that might not sound very good. However, if you know that most of the market indices are down 10%, then your 2% maybe starts to look a little bit better, doesn't it? Now, there's something else worth considering when evaluating returns. Maria, why don't you talk about that?
Sure. So, generally speaking, firms will focus on absolute returns, and in a way that seems fair, right? After all, isn't the bottom line number the one that counts? But what if the high return on my portfolio was achieved while employing undue risk? Having that piece of information changes the way we feel about things. When we give thought to what level of risk was taken in order to achieve a certain return, we are considering the risk adjusted return. So while it's tempting to see how our portfolio returns stack up in relation to one another or to others, once we begin to understand and apply the concept of the risk adjusted return, we begin to realize that other clients' circumstances, including their risk tolerance, they're unique to them, and that drawing such comparisons is not always helpful. So, Janet, why don't you give us a quick recap on today's segment?
Sure. So here's the rundown. One, formulating a return objective should be goals driven, and that can involve a meaningful conversation with your portfolio manager in order to ascertain what is the purpose behind a particular portfolio. And I won't say too much here because there are so many factors involved in this particular piece, and we will be covering that in a future segment. Two, absolute and relative returns both have merits when evaluating returns. One just needs to understand the limitations of each. And lastly, number three, understanding your return should go hand in hand with understanding the level of risk taken to achieve your rate of return. With that knowledge, we have better wisdom that can enable us to make more meaningful judgments. Return, considered alongside the risk that was taken to get there, allows for a more informative assessment to be made. A high return in and of itself is certainly desirable, but a high return alongside high risk can be a dangerous game to play. Whereas a consistent rate of return achieved while employing the minimum amount of risk necessary is prudent and wise. All things considered, a decent risk-adjusted return comes with one final intangible that you can't put a price on: peace of mind.
Thanks, Janet. That's a great summary. If you have any further questions about either formulating your return objectives or evaluating your return, please feel free to reach out to your portfolio manager. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Your Wealth Matters, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Bye for now.
Bye.